Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 9, Side 2. The outstanding figure in this humane dynasty of healers was Abu Bakr Muhammad al-Razi, who lived from 844 to 926, famous in Europe as Razis. Like most of the leading scientists and poets of his time, he was a Persian writing in Arabic. Born at Rai, near Tehran, he studied chemistry, alchemy, and medicine at Baghdad and wrote some 131 books, half of them on medicine, most of them lost. His Kitab al-Hawi, or comprehensive book, covered in 20 volumes every branch of medicine. Translated into Latin as Liber Continens, it was probably the most highly respected and frequently used medical textbook in the white world for several centuries. It was one of the 9 books that composed the whole library of the medical faculty at the University of Paris in 1395. His treatise on smallpox and measles was a masterpiece of direct observation and clinical analysis. It was the first accurate study of infectious diseases, the first effort to distinguish the two ailments. We may judge its influence and repute by the 40 English editions printed between 1498 and 1866. The most famous of al-Razi's works was a 10-volume survey of medicine, the Kitab al-Mansuri, the Book for al-Mansur, dedicated to a prince of Khorasan. Gerard of Cremona translated it into Latin. The 9th volume of this translation, the Nonus al-Mansuris, was a popular text in Europe till the 16th century. Al-Razi introduced new remedies like mercurial ointment and the use of animal gut in sutures. He checked the enthusiasm for urinalysis in an age when physicians were prone to diagnose any disease by examining the urine, sometimes without seeing the patient. Some of his shorter works showed a genial side. One was on the fact that even skillful physicians cannot cure all diseases. Another was entitled, Why Ignorant Physicians, Laymen, and Women Have More Success Than Learned Medical Men. Al-Razi was by common consent the greatest of Moslem physicians and the greatest clinician of the Middle Ages. He died in poverty at the age of 82. In the School of Medicine at the University of Paris hang 2 portraits of Moslem physicians, Razis and Avicenna. Islam knew its greatest philosopher and its most famous physician as Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Sina, who lived from 980 to 1037. His autobiography, one of the few in Arabic literature, shows us how mobile might be in medieval days the life of a scholar or sage. Son of a money-changer of Bokhara, Avicenna was educated by private tutors, who gave a Sufi mystic turn to an otherwise scientific mind. At the age of 10, says Ibn Khalikan, with customary Oriental hyperbole, he was a perfect master of the Koran and general literature, and had obtained a certain degree of information in theology, arithmetic, and algebra. He studied medicine without a teacher, and while still young began to give gratis treatment. At 17 he brought back to health the ailing ruler of Bukhara, Nu ibn Mansur, became an official of the court, and spent eager hours in the Sultan's voluminous library. The break-up of the Samanid power towards the end of the 10th century led Avicenna to take service under Al-Mamun, Prince of Khwarizm. When Mahmud of Ghazni sent for Avicenna, Al-Biruni, and other intellectual lights of Al-Mamun's court, Avicenna refused to go. With a fellow scholar, Masihi, he escaped into the desert. There, in a dust storm, Masihi died, but Avicenna, after many hardships, reached Gurgan and took service at the court of Qaboos. Mahmud circulated throughout Persia a picture of Avicenna and offered a reward for his capture, but Qaboos protected him. When Qaboos was murdered, Avicenna was called to treat the emir of Hamadan. He succeeded so well that he was made vizier. But the army did not like his rule. It seized him, pillaged his home, and proposed his death. He escaped, hid himself in the rooms of a druggist, and began in his confinement to write the books that were to make his fame. As he was planning a secret departure from Hamadan, he was arrested by the emir's son and spent several months in jail, where he continued his writing. He again escaped, disguised himself as a Sufi mystic, and after adventures too numerous for our space, found refuge and honors at the court of Ala ad-Dawla, the Buwayyid emir of Isfahan. A circle of scientists and philosophers gathered about him and held learned conferences over which the emir liked to preside. Some stories suggest that the philosopher enjoyed the pleasures of love as well as of scholarship. On the other hand, we get reports of him as absorbed day and night in study, teaching, and public affairs. And Ibn Khalikan quotes from him some unhackneyed counsel. "Take 1 meal a day. Preserve the seminal fluid with care. It is the water of life to be poured into the womb." Worn out too soon, he died at 57 on a journey to Hamadan, where to this day pious veneration guards his grave. Amid these vicissitudes, he found time, in office or in jail, in Persian or in Arabic, to write 100 books, covering nearly every field of science and philosophy. For good measure, he composed excellent poems, of which 15 survive. One of them slipped into the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Another, The Descent of the Soul into the Body from a Higher Sphere, is still memorized by young students in the Moslem East. He translated Euclid, made astronomical observations, and devised an instrument like our vernier. He made original studies of motion, force, vacuum, light, heat, and specific gravity. His treatise on minerals was a main source of European geology until the 13th century. His remarks on the formation of mountains is a model of clarity. Mountains may be due to 2 different causes. Either they result from upheavals of the earth's crust, such as might occur in violent earthquake, or they are the effect of water, which, cutting for itself a new route, has denuded the valleys. The strata are of different kinds, some soft, some hard. The winds and waters disintegrate the first kind, but leave the other intact. It would require a long period of time for all such changes to be accomplished, but that water has been the main cause of these effects is proved by the existence of fossil remains of aquatic animals on many mountains. 2 gigantic productions contain Avicenna's teaching: the Kitab al-Shifa, or Book of Healing, pertaining to healing of the soul, an 18-volume encyclopedia of mathematics, physics, metaphysics, theology, economics, politics, and music, and the Kanun fil Tib, or Canon of Medicine, a gigantic survey of physiology, hygiene, therapy, and pharmacology, with sundry excursions into philosophy. The Kanun is well organized and has moments of eloquence, but its scholastic passion for classification and distinction becomes the one disease for which the author has no prescription. He begins with a discouraging admonition: "Every follower of my teachings who wishes to use them profitably should memorize most of this work," which contains 1,000,000 words. He conceives medicine as the art of removing an impediment to the normal functioning of nature. He deals first with the major diseases, their symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment. He has chapters on general and individual prophylaxis and hygiene, and on therapy through enemas, bleeding, cautery, baths, and massage. He recommends deep breathing, even occasional shouting, to develop the lungs, chest, and uvula. Book 2 summarizes Greek and Arabic knowledge of medicinal plants. Book 3, on special pathology, contains excellent discussions of pleurisy, epyema, intestinal disorders, sexual diseases, perversions, and nervous ailments, including love. Book 4 discusses fevers, surgery and cosmetics, the care of the hair and the skin. Book 5, Materia Medica, gives detailed directions for concocting 760 drugs. The Kanun, translated into Latin in the 12th century, dethroned Al-Razi and even Galen as the chief text in European medical schools. It held its place as required reading in the universities of Montpellier and Louvain till the middle of the 17th century. Avicenna was the greatest writer on medicine, Al-Razi the greatest physician, Al-Biruni the greatest geographer, Al-Haytham the greatest optician, Jabir probably the greatest chemist of the Middle Ages. These 5 names, so little known in present-day Christendom, are one measure of our provincialism in viewing medieval history. Arabic, like all medieval science, was often sullied with occultism. Except in optics, it excelled rather in the synthesis of accumulated results than in original findings or systematic research. At the same time, however haltingly, it developed in alchemy that experimental method which is the greatest pride and tool of the modern mind. When Roger Bacon proclaimed that method to Europe 500 years after Jabir, he owed his illumination to the Moors of Spain, whose light had come from the Moslem East. 4. Philosophy. In philosophy, as in science, Islam borrowed from Christian Syria the legacy of pagan Greece, and returned it through Moslem Spain to Christian Europe. Many influences, of course, ran together to produce the intellectual rebellion of the Mutazilites and the philosophies of Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes. Hindu speculations came in through Ghazni and Persia. Zoroastrian and Jewish eschatology played some minor role, and Christian heretics had stirred the air of the Near East with debate on the attributes of God, the nature of Christ and the Logos, predestination and free will, revelation and reason. But the yeast that caused the ferment of thought in Moslem Asia, as in Renaissance Italy, was the rediscovery of Greece. Here, through however imperfect translations of apocryphal texts, a new world appeared, one in which men had reasoned fearlessly about everything, unchecked by sacred scriptures, and had conceived a cosmos not of divine whimsy and incalculable miracle, but of majestic and omnipresent law. Greek logic, fully conveyed through Aristotle's Organon, came like an intoxication to Moslems now gifted with leisure to think. Here were the terms and implements they needed for thought. Now, for 3 centuries, Islam played the new game of logic, drunk like the Athenian youth of Plato's time with the dear delight of philosophy. Soon the whole edifice of Mohammedan dogma began to tremble and crack, as Greek orthodoxy had melted under the sophists' eloquence, as Christian orthodoxy would wince and wilt under the blows of the encyclopedists and the whips of Voltaire's wit. What might be called the Moslem Enlightenment had its proximate origin in a strange dispute. Was the Koran eternal or created? Philo's doctrine of the Logos as the timeless wisdom of God, the 4 Gospels' identification of Christ with the Logos, the divine word or reason, that was in the beginning was God, and without which was not anything made that was made, the Gnostic and Neoplatonic personification of divine wisdom as the agent of creation, the Jewish belief in the eternity of the Torah, all conspired to beget in Orthodox Islam a correlative view that the Quran had always existed in the mind of Allah, and that only its revelation to Muhammad was an event in time. The first expression of philosophy in Islam, circa 757, was the growth of a school of Mutazilites, that is, seceders, who denied the eternity of the Quran. They protested their respect for Islam's holy book, but they argued that where it or the Hadith contradicted reason, the Quran or the traditions must be interpreted allegorically, and they gave the name kalam, or logic, to this effort to reconcile reason and faith. It seemed to them absurd to take literally those Quranic passages that ascribed hands and feet, anger and hatred to Allah. Such poetic anthropomorphism, however adapted to the moral and political ends of Muhammad at the time, could hardly be accepted by the educated intellect. The human mind could never know what was the real nature or attributes of God. It could only agree with faith in affirming a spiritual power as the foundation of all reality. Furthermore, to the Mutazilites it seemed fatal to human morality and enterprise to believe, as orthodoxy did, in the complete predestination of all events by God, and the arbitrary election from all eternity of the saved and the damned. In 100 variations of these themes, Mutazilite doctrines spread rapidly under the rule of al-Mansur, Harun al-Rashid, and al-Mamun. At first in the privacy of scholars and infidels, then in the soirees of the caliphs, finally in the lecture circles of colleges and mosques, the new rationalism won a voice, even here and there, ascendancy. Al-Mamun was fascinated by this fledgling flight of reason, defended it, and ended by proclaiming the Mutazilite views as the official faith of the realm. Mingling old habits of Oriental monarchy with the latest ideas of Hellenizing Moslems, Al-Mamun in 832 issued a decree requiring all Moslems to admit that the Quran had been created in time. A later decree ruled that no one could be a witness in law or a judge unless he declared his acceptance of the new dogma. Further decrees extended this obligatory acceptance to the doctrines of free will and the impossibility of the soul ever seeing God with a physical eye. At last, refusal to take these tests and oaths was made a capital crime. Al-Mamun died in 833, but his successors, Al-Mutasim and Al-Watiq, continued his campaign. The theologian Ibn Hanbal denounced this inquisition. Summoned to take the tests, he answered all questions by quoting the Quran in favor of the orthodox view. He was scourged to unconsciousness and cast into jail, but his sufferings made him in the eyes of the people a martyr and a saint, and prepared for the reaction that overwhelmed Moslem philosophy. Meanwhile, that philosophy had produced its first major figure. Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi was born in Kufa about 803, son of the governor of the city. He studied there and at Baghdad, and won a high reputation at the courts of Al-Mamun and Al-Mutasim as translator, scientist, and philosopher. Like so many thinkers in that confident heyday of the Moslem mind, he was an omnivorous polymath, studying everything, writing 265 treatises about everything, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, meteorology, geography, physics, politics, music, medicine, philosophy. He agreed with Plato that no one could be a philosopher without being first a mathematician, and he struggled to reduce health, medicine, and music to mathematical relations. He studied the tides, sought the laws that determine the speed of a falling body, and investigated the phenomena of light in a book on optics which influenced Roger Bacon. He shocked the Moslem world by writing an apology for Christianity. He and an aide translated the apocryphal Theology of Aristotle. He was deeply impressed by this forgery, and rejoiced in the thought that it reconciled Aristotle with Plato, by turning both of them into Neoplatonists. Al-Kindi's philosophy was Neoplatonism restated. Spirit has three grades: God, the creative world soul or logos, and its emanation, the soul of man. If a man trains his soul to right knowledge, he can achieve freedom and deathlessness. Apparently Al-Kindi made heroic efforts to be orthodox, yet he took from Aristotle the distinction between the active intellect, which is divine, and the passive intellect of man, which is merely the capacity for thought. Avicenna would transmit this distinction to Averroes, who would set the world by the ears with it as an argument against personal immortality. Al-Kindi associated with the Mutazilites. When the reaction came, his library was confiscated and his deathlessness hung by a thread. He survived the storm, recovered his library, and lived till 873. In a society where government, law, and morality are bound up with a religious creed, any attack upon that creed is viewed as menacing the foundations of social order itself. All the forces that had been beaten down by the Arab conquest, Greek philosophy, Gnostic Christianity, Persian nationalism, Mazdakite communism, were rampantly resurgent. The Koran was questioned and ridiculed. A Persian poet was decapitated for proclaiming the superiority of his verses to the Koran in 784. The whole structure of Islam, resting on the Koran, seemed ready to collapse. In this crisis, three factors made orthodoxy victorious: a conservative caliph, the rise of the Turkish Guard, and the natural loyalty of the people to their inherited beliefs. Al-Mutawakkil, coming to the throne in 847, based his support upon the populace and the Turks, new converts to Mohammedanism, hostile to the Persians, and strangers to Greek thought, gave themselves with a whole heart to a policy of saving the faith by the sword. Al-Mutawakkil annulled and reversed the illiberal liberalism of Al-Mamun. Mutazilites and other heretics were expelled from governmental employ and educational positions. Any expression of heterodox ideas in literature or philosophy was forbidden. The eternity of the Koran was re-established by law. The Shia sect was proscribed, and the shrine of Hussein at Kerbela was destroyed in 851. The edict allegedly issued by Omar I against Christians and extended to the Jews by Harun in 807, and soon ignored again, was reissued by Al-Mutawakkil in 850. Jews and Christians were ordered to wear a distinctive color of dress, put colored patches on the garments of their slaves, ride only on mules and asses, and affix wooden devils to their doors. New churches and synagogues were to be pulled down, and no public elevation of the cross was to be allowed in Christian ceremonies. No Christian or Jew was to receive education in Moslem schools. In the next generation, the reaction took a milder form. Some Orthodox theologians, bravely accepting the gauge of logic, proposed to prove by reason the truth of the traditional faith. These mutakallimun, that is, logicians, were the scholastics of Islam. They undertook that same reconciliation of religious dogma with Greek philosophy, which Maimonides in the 12th century would attempt for Judaism, and Thomas Aquinas in the 13th for Christianity. Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari of Basra, who lived from 873 to 935, after teaching Mutazilite doctrines for a decade, turned against them in his 40th year, attacked them with the Mutazilite weapon of logic, and poured forth a stream of conservative polemics that shared powerfully in the victory of the old creed. He accepted the predestinarianism of Muhammad without flinching. God has predetermined every act and event, and is their primary cause. He is above all law and morals. He rules as a sovereign over his creatures, doing what he wills. If he were to send them all to hell, there would be no wrong. Not all the orthodox relished this submission of the faith to intellectual debate. Many proclaimed the formula bila kaif, believe without asking how. The theologians, for the most part, ceased to discuss basic issues, but lost themselves in the scholastic minutiae of a doctrine whose fundamentals they accepted as axioms. The ferment of philosophy subsided at Baghdad, only to emerge at minor courts. Saiful-Dawla provided a house at Aleppo for Muhammad Abu Nasr al-Farabi, the first Turk to make a name in philosophy. Born at Farab in Turkestan, he studied logic under Christian teachers at Baghdad and Haran, read Aristotle's Physics 40 times and the De Anima 200 times, was denounced as a heretic at Baghdad, adopted the doctrine and dress of a Sufi, and lived like the swallows of the air. He was the most indifferent of men to the things of this world, says Ibn Khalikan. He never gave himself the least trouble to acquire a livelihood or possess a habitation. Saiful-Dawla asked him how much he needed for his maintenance. Al-Farabi thought that 4 dirhams, or $2 a day, would suffice. The prince settled this allowance on him for life. 39 works by Al-Farabi survive, many of them commentaries on Aristotle. His Isa al-Ulum, or Encyclopedia of Science, summarized the knowledge of his time in philology, logic, mathematics, physics, chemistry, economics, and politics. He answered with a straightforward negative the question that would soon agitate the scholastic philosophers of Christendom. Does the universal, the genus, the species, or the quality, exist apart from the specific individual? Deceived like the rest by the theology of Aristotle, he transformed the hard-headed Stagirite into a mystic, and lived long enough to subside into orthodox belief. Having in his youth professed a theoretical agnosticism, he progressed sufficiently in later life to give a detailed description of the deity. He took over Aristotle's proofs of God's existence very much as Aquinas would do 3 centuries later. A chain of contingent events requires for its intelligibility an ultimate necessary being. A chain of causes requires a first cause. A series of motions requires a prime mover unmoved. Multiplicity requires unity. The ultimate goal of philosophy, never quite attainable, is knowledge of the first cause. The best approach to such knowledge is purity of soul. Like Aristotle, Al-Farabi carefully managed to make himself unintelligible on immortality. He died at Damascus in 950. One work alone among his remains strikes us with its original force. Al-Medina al-Fadila, the Ideal City. It opens with a description of the law of nature as one of perpetual struggle of each organism against all the rest. Hobbes's bellum omnium contra omnes. Every living thing, in the last analysis, sees in all other living things a means to its ends. Some cynics argue from this, says Al-Farabi, that in this inescapable competition the wise man is he who best bends others to his will and most fully achieves his own desires. How did human society emerge from this jungle law? If we may trust Al-Farabi's account, there were both Rousseauians and Nietzscheans among the Moslems who took up this question. Some thought that society had begun in an agreement among individuals that their survival required the acceptance of certain restraints through custom or law. Others laughed this social contract out of history and insisted that society or the state had begun as the conquest and regimentation of the weak by the strong. States themselves, said these Nietzscheans, are organs of competition. It is natural that states should struggle with one another for ascendancy, security, power, and wealth. War is natural and inevitable, and in that final arbitrament, as in the law of nature, the only right is might. Al-Farabi counters this view with an appeal to his fellow men to build a society not upon envy, power, and strife, but upon reason, devotion, and love. He ends safely by recommending a monarchy based upon strong religious belief. A pupil of Al-Farabi, established at Baghdad about 970, an association of savants, known to us only from its founder's place name as the Sigistani Society, for the discussion of philosophical problems. No questions were asked as to the national origin or religious affiliation of any member. The group seems to have drowned itself in logic and epistemology, but its existence indicates that intellectual appetite survived in the capital. Of greater moment or result was a similar but secret fraternity of scientists and philosophers organized at Basra about 983. These brethren of sincerity, or purity, Ikhwan al-Safa, were alarmed by the weakening of the caliphate, the poverty of the people, and the corruption of morals. They aspired to a moral, spiritual, and political renovation of Islam, and thought that this renewal might be founded upon a blend of Greek philosophy, Christian ethics, Sufi mysticism, Shia politics, and Moslem law. They conceived friendship as a collaboration of abilities and virtues, each party bringing to the union a quality of which the others had lack and need. Truth, they thought, comes more readily from a meeting of minds than from individual thought. So they privately met and discussed, with fine freedom, catholicity, and courtesy, all the basic problems of life, and finally issued 51 tracts as their considered and cooperative system and epitome of science, religion, and philosophy. A Spanish Moslem, traveling in the Near East about the year 1000, took a fancy to these treatises, collected them, and preserved them. In these 1134 pages we find scientific explanations of tides, earthquakes, eclipses, sound waves, and many other natural phenomena, a full acceptance of astrology and alchemy, and occasional dallying with magic and numerology. The theology, as in nearly all Moslem thinkers, is Gnostic and Neoplatonic. From the first cause, or God, emanates the active intelligence, logos, or reason, from which proceeds the world of bodies and souls. All material things are formed by and act through soul. Every soul is restless until it rejoins the active intelligence or world soul. This union demands absolute purity in the soul. Ethics is the art of attaining this purity. Science, philosophy, and religion are means to such purification. In seeking purity, we must try to model ourselves upon the intellectual devotion of Socrates, the universal charity of Christ, and the modest nobility of Ali. When the mind has been emancipated by knowledge, it should feel free to reinterpret through allegory, and thereby reconcile with philosophy the crude expressions of the Koran which were adapted to the understanding of an uncivilized desert people. A sharp Persian retort to Arab pride. All in all, these 51 tracts constitute the fullest and most consistent expression that we possess of Moslem thought in the Abbasid age. The orthodox leaders in Baghdad burned them as heresy in 1150, but they continued to circulate and exercised a pervasive influence upon Moslem and Jewish philosophy, upon Al-Ghazali and Averroes, Ibn Gabirol and Judah Halevi, the philosophical poet Al-Mari, and perhaps upon the man who in his brief life rivaled the scope and depth and surpassed the rationality of this cooperative synthesis. For Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, was not content to be a scientist and a world-renowned authority on medicine. Doubtless he knew that a scientist completes himself only through philosophy. He tells us that he read Aristotle's Metaphysics 40 times without understanding it, and that when Al-Farabi's commentary enabled him to comprehend the book, he was so happy and grateful that he rushed into the street and scattered alms. Aristotle remained to the end his ideal in philosophy. Already in the Qanun he used of him that phrase, the philosopher, which was to become in the Latin world a synonym for Aristotle. He detailed his own philosophy in the Kitab al-Shifa, and then summarized it in the Najat. He had a flair for logic and insisted on precise definitions. He gave the classic medieval answer to the question whether universals or general ideas, man, virtue, redness, exist apart from individual things. They exist, 1, ante-race, before the things, in the mind of God as Platonic exemplars according to which the things are made. 2, in rebus, in the things in which they appear or are exemplified. And 3, post-race, after the things, as abstracted ideas in the human mind. But universals do not exist in the natural world apart from individual things. Abelard and Aquinas would, after a century of turmoil, give the same reply. Indeed, Avicenna's metaphysics is almost a summary of what, 2 centuries after him, the Latin thinkers would syncretize as the scholastic philosophy. He begins with a laborious restatement of Aristotle and Al-Farabi on matter and form, the 4 causes, the contingent and the necessary, the many and the one, and frets over the puzzle of how the contingent and changeable many, the multiplicity of mortal things, could ever have flowed from the necessary and changeless one. Like Plotinus, he thinks to solve the problem by postulating an intermediate active intelligence, distributed through the celestial, material, and human world as souls. Finding some difficulty in reconciling God's passage from non-creation to creation with the divine immutability, he proposes to believe with Aristotle in the eternity of the material world. But knowing that this will offend the Mutakalimun, he offers them a compromise by a favorite scholastic distinction. God is prior to the world not in time, but logically, that is, in rank and essence and cause. The existence of the world depends at every moment upon the existence of its sustaining force, which is God. Avicenna concedes that all entities but God are contingent, that is, their existence is not inevitable or indispensable. Since such contingent things require a cause for their existence, they cannot be explained except by reverting in the chain of causes to a necessary being, one whose essence or meaning involves existence, a being whose existence must be presupposed in order to explain any other existence. God is the only being that exists by its own essence. It is essential that he exist, for without such a first cause nothing that is could have begun to be. Since all matter is contingent, that is, its essence does not involve existence, God cannot be material. For like reasons he must be simple and one. Since there is intelligence in created beings, there must be intelligence in their creator. The supreme intelligence sees all things, past, present, and future, not in time or sequence, but at once. Their occurrence is the temporal result of his timeless thought. But God does not directly cause each action or event. Things develop by an internal teleology. They have their purposes and destinies written in themselves. Therefore God is not responsible for evil. Evil is the price we pay for freedom of will, and the evil of the part may be the good of the whole. The existence of the soul is attested by our most immediate internal perception. The soul is spiritual for the same reason. We simply perceive it to be so. Our ideas are clearly distinct from our organs. The soul is the principle of self-movement and growth in a body. In this sense, even the celestial spheres have souls. The whole cosmos is the manifestation of a universal principle of life. By itself a body can cause nothing. The cause of its every motion is its inherent soul. Every soul or intelligence possesses a measure of freedom and creative power akin to that of the first cause, for it is an emanation of that cause. After death, the pure soul returns to union with the world soul, and in this union lies the blessedness of the good. Avicenna achieved as well as any man the ever-sought reconciliation between the faith of the people and the reasoning of the philosophers. He did not wish, like Lucretius, to destroy religion for the sake of philosophy, nor, like Al-Ghazali in the ensuing century, to destroy philosophy for the sake of religion. He treats all questions with reason only, quite independently of the Quran, and gives a naturalistic analysis of inspiration. But he affirms the people's need of prophets, who expound to them the laws of morality in forms and parables popularly intelligible and effective. In this sense, as laying or preserving the foundations of social and moral development, the prophet is God's messenger. So Mohammed preached the resurrection of the body, and sometimes described heaven in material terms. The philosopher will doubt the immortality of the body, but he will recognize that if Mohammed had taught a purely spiritual heaven, the people would not have listened to him, and would not have united into a disciplined and powerful nation. Those who can worship God in spiritual love, entertaining neither hope nor fear, are the highest of mankind. But they will reveal this attitude only to their maturest students, not to the multitude. Avicenna's Shifa and Kanun mark the apex of medieval thought and constitute one of the major syntheses in the history of the mind. Much of it followed the lead of Aristotle and Al-Farabi, as much of Aristotle followed Plato. Only lunatics can be completely original. Avicenna occasionally talks what seems to our fallible judgment to be nonsense, But that is also true of Plato and Aristotle. There is nothing so foolish but it may be found in the pages of the philosophers. Avicenna lacked the honest uncertainty, critical spirit, and ever-open mind of Al-Biruni, and made many more mistakes. Synthesis must pay that price as long as life is brief. He surpassed his rivals in the clarity and vivacity of his style, in the ability to relieve and illuminate abstract thought with illustrative anecdote and pardonable poetry, and in the unparalleled scope of his scientific and philosophical range. His influence was immense. It reached out to Spain to mold Averroes and Maimonides, and into Latin Christendom to help the great scholastics. It is astonishing how much of Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas goes back to Avicenna. Roger Bacon called him the chief authority in philosophy after Aristotle, and Aquinas was not merely practicing his customary courtesy in speaking of him with as much respect as of Plato. Arabic philosophy in the East almost died with Avicenna. Soon after his culminating effort, the orthodox emphasis of the Seljuks, the frightened fideism of the theologians, the victorious mysticism of Al-Ghazali put a cloture on speculative thought. It is a pity that we know these 3 centuries, from 750 to 1050, of Arabic efflorescence so imperfectly. Thousands of Arabic manuscripts in science, literature, and philosophy lie hidden in the libraries of the Moslem world. In Constantinople alone there are 30 mosque libraries whose wealth has been merely scratched. In Cairo, Damascus, Mosul, Baghdad, Delhi, are great collections not even catalogued. An immense library in the Escorial near Madrid has hardly completed the listing of its Islamic manuscripts in science, literature, jurisprudence, and philosophy. What we know of Moslem thought in those centuries is a fragment of what survives. What survives is a fragment of what was produced. What appears in these pages is a morsel of a fraction of a fragment. When scholarship has surveyed more thoroughly this half-forgotten legacy, we shall probably rank the 10th century in Eastern Islam as one of the golden ages in the history of the mind. 5. Mysticism and Heresy. At their peak, philosophy and religion meet in the sense and contemplation of universal unity. The soul, untouched by logic, too weak of wing for the metaphysical flight from the many to the one, from incident to law, might reach that vision through a mystic absorption of the separate self in the soul of the world. And where science and philosophy failed, where the brief, finite reason of man faltered and turned blind in the presence of infinity, faith might mount to the feet of God by ascetic discipline, unselfish devotion, the unconditional surrender of the part to the whole. Moslem mysticism had many roots: the asceticism of the Hindu fakirs, the Gnosticism of Egypt and Syria, the Neoplatonist speculations of the later Greeks, and the omnipresent example of ascetic Christian monks. As in Christendom, so in Islam a pious minority protested against any accommodation of religion to the interests and practices of the economic world. They denounced the luxury of caliphs, viziers, and merchants, and proposed to return to the simplicity of Abu Bakr and Omar I. They resented any intermediary between themselves and the deity. Even the rigid ritual of the mosque seemed to them an obstacle to that mystic state in which the soul, purified of all earthly concerns, rose not only to the beatific vision, but to unity with God. The movement flourished mostly in Persia, perhaps through proximity to India, through Christian influence at Jundi Shapur, and through Neoplatonist traditions established by the Greek philosophers who fled from Athens to Persia in 529. Most Moslem mystics called themselves Sufis, from the simple robe of wool, or suf, that they wore. But within that term were embraced sincere enthusiasts, exalted poets, pantheists, ascetics, charlatans, and men with many wives. Their doctrine varied from time to time and from street to street. The Sufis, said Averroes, maintain that the knowledge of God is found in our own hearts, after our detachment from all physical desires and the concentration of the mind upon the desired object. But many Sufis tried to reach God through external objects, too. Whatever we see of perfection or loveliness in the world is due to the presence or operation of divinity in them. "O God," said one mystic, "I never listen to the cry of animals, or the quivering of trees, or the murmur of water, or the song of birds, or the rustling wind, or the crashing thunder, without feeling them to be evidence of thy unity, and a proof that there is nothing like unto thee." In reality, the mystic held, these individual things exist only by the divine power in them. Their sole reality is this underlying divinity. Therefore God is all, Not only is there no God but Allah, there is no being but God. Consequently, each soul is God, and the full-blooded mystic shamelessly avers that God and I are one. Verily, I am God, said Abu Yazid around 900. There is no God but me, worship me. I am he whom I love, said Hussein al-Hallaj. And he whom I love is I. I am he who drowned the people of Noah. I am the truth. Hallaj was arrested for exaggeration, scourged with 1,000 stripes, and burned to death in 922. His followers claimed to have seen and talked with him after this interruption, and many Sufis made him their favorite saint. The Sufi, like the Hindu, believed in a course of discipline as necessary to the mystic revelation of God, purifying exercises of devotion, meditation, and prayer, the full obedience of the novice to a Sufi master or teacher, and the complete abandonment of any personal desire, even the desire for salvation or the mystical union. The perfect Sufi loves God for his own sake, not for any reward. The giver, said Abul Qasim, is better for you than the gift. Usually, however, the Sufi valued his discipline as a means of reaching a true knowledge of things, sometimes as a curriculum leading to a degree of miraculous power over nature, but almost always as a road to union with God. He who had completely forgotten his individual self in such union was called Al-Insanul Kamil, the perfect man. Such a man, the Sufis believed, was above all laws, even above the obligation to pilgrimage. Said a Sufi verse, all eyes toward the Kaaba turn, but ours to the Beloved's face. Until the middle of the 11th century, the Sufis continued to live in the world, sometimes with their families and their children. Even the Sufis attached small moral worth to celibacy. The true saint, said Abu Sa'id, goes in and out amongst the people, eats and sleeps with them, buys and sells in the market, marries and takes part in social intercourse, and never forgets God for a single moment. Such Sufis were distinguished only by their simplicity of life, their piety and quietism, very much like the early Quakers, and occasionally they gathered around some holy teacher or exemplar, or met in groups for prayer and mutual stimulation to devotion. Already in the 10th century, those strange dervish dances were taking form which were to play so prominent a part in later Sufism. A few became recluses and tormented themselves, but asceticism was in this period discountenanced and rare. Saints, unknown to early Islam, became numerous in Sufism. One of the earliest was a woman, Rabia al-Adawiyah, of Basra, who lived from 717 to 801. Sold as a slave in youth, she was freed because her master saw a radiance above her head while she prayed. Refusing marriage, she lived a life of self-denial and charity. Asked if she hated Satan, she answered, "My love for God leaves me no room for hating Satan." Tradition ascribes to her a famous Sufi saying, O God, give to thine enemies whatever thou hast assigned to me of this world's goods, and to thy friends whatever thou hast assigned to me in the life to come. For thou thyself art sufficient for me. Let us take as an example of many Sufis the saint and poet Abu Sa'id ibn Abil Khair, who lived from 967 to 1049. This book is continued on Cassette 10, Side 1.